Good evening, everyone. Good to see you all. We actually have a live audience for once for a Tocqueville lecture. So good to have you here. Good for those people online. Hello. We're welcome to have you here today. The Tocqueville lecture series is named after Alexis de Tocqueville. Born in the French aristocracy, Tocqueville examined the world to understand democracy. His investigations convinced him that liberal ideas, which rejected both the antiquity of aristocracy and doubted the promise of the French Revolution, were the progression of history. Whether individuals fought for or against these ideals, he was convinced that equality of conditions is a providential fact. This lecture series invites scholars, professionals, and civic leaders to present on the ideas of liberty and equality as they relate to other concepts important in the founding and continuation of American government. These are free public lectures which invite the campus of Jacksonville State University, other institutions of learning, and the surrounding community to come together to listen, think, reflect, and engage with each other. And really, we can finally engage with each other a bit. The Tocqueville Lecture Series is funded by a generous grant from the Jack Miller Center. The Jack Miller Center is dedicated to advancing education in America's history, its political and economic institutions, and the central principles, ideas, and issues arising from the American and Western traditions, which continue to animate our national life. In addition, the Department of History and Foreign Languages, a part of the College of Arts and Humanities at Jacksonville State University, is a proud sponsor of tonight's event too. It gives me great pleasure here to introduce what I would consider one of our own to come back home to us. Dr. Prudlo received his PhD from the University of Virginia and currently holds the Warren Chair of Catholic Studies at the University of Tulsa. His works in intellectual and religious histories, having authored several books, the most recent of which is Thomas Aquinas, a historical, theological, and environmental portrait. He was also privileged, and I didn't write this, so I'm just reading what was given. He was also privileged for 13 years to be a professor of history right here at JSU. I was not the privilege, but we were privileged too. And he's happy to return as often as we can stand him. Everyone, thank you for coming. Please welcome forward Dr. Don Prudlo.
Alexis de Tocqueville knew that the keys to the American Republic were a balance of liberty and responsibility. Now, unfortunately, I'm going to need your permission to have a little liberty tonight in order to inform you more about responsibility. So we have a nice socially distant area, a lot of Catholics in the audience. They're way back, so for those of you online, I'm not endangering anyone, I hope. We've had technical problems, which those of us who have been teaching for the last 2 years know are endemic and are natural to our profession now. So anytime I say something that's strange, just think it will be totally solved by a beautiful slide behind me. That there will be hilarious memes that will entertain you throughout the entire talk. So just imagine that, and that'll do most of the heavy lifting for my absent PowerPoint. It's also today the 450th anniversary of a very important event in history. Does anyone besides Dr. Lemons know what the important event is that was 450 years ago today?
Rescue of Western civilization.
Yeah, one of them. one of the many rescues. Which one was it, Dr. Lemons?
Lepanto.
The Battle of Lepanto, right, where the Turkish Navy was thwarted in its attempts to attack southern Europe. And so this paper is, in a certain sense, has helped to contribute to the victory of Lepanto. Not this paper, but the items in this paper helped to contribute to the victory of Lepanto. So tonight, I want to sit back and think about all the lovely medieval images I'm going to show you about liberty and responsibility in the pre-modern world. Now, old habits are really, really hard to break. Whenever politicians, and it doesn't matter what kind of politician, wants to demonize someone, wants to demonize Islamic fundamentalism, they talk about how medieval it is. Before he was elected, President Trump suggested that we were living in medieval times, and that was not either the fun place to go watch jousting or the actual time period that he was speaking of. He was speaking about now. But the term medieval has become, in popular parlance, a byword for barbarism, systemic violence, backwardness, and hatred. And in Monty Python's hilarious Holy Grail, medieval people are depicted as dirty and benighted by superstition. The myth of the Dark Ages was one created primarily during the Enlightenment, not the least by Edward Gibbon and David Hume. And historians have long been dismantling these misreadings, born of prejudice and then perpetuated by cultural illiteracy. But the results of academic study very often, we find, to our chagrin, don't trickle down and are often submerged in tsunamis of popular misconception, bundled into portable ignorance containers like the Da Vinci Code and sold in quantity at airport bookshops. I want to propose a new model for you tonight, backed by scholarship, that sees the period as one of the high points in the history of humanity, one that was crucial for the formation of the world we live in today. That period took the best of the ancient traditions and wove them into what we call today Western civilization. Indeed, the medieval era, though seemingly far removed from our own founding as a nation, was irreducibly central to who we have become as Americans. Many of the things that we value today came from that world, from representative government to limitations of central authority, from the tools of advanced capitalism to the separation and independence of religion. It is no stretch to say that the medieval world was the crucible that formed us as a people. Far from being a bastion of mindless violence and chaos, it can be summed up in one word: harmony. C.S. Lewis said, at his most characteristic, medieval man was not a dreamer or a wanderer. He was an organizer, a codifier, and a builder of systems. The world was a harmonious unity, an intelligible, logocentric universe descending from a God who was himself logos. Such a cosmos was knowable through our own rational participation in it. Medieval people were seeking, in every field of endeavor, a single, complex, concordant model of the whole of creation. In light of the unity of God and the harmony of the Trinity, they sought to understand the structure of the ordered and rational world that they found themselves embedded in. You can see this in their polyphony, in their architecture, in their intellectual endeavors, and in their nascent religious and political orders. The overarching scheme in which they embedded this vision is called Western civilization. And we cannot speak about this civilization without understanding what came first, without understanding the careful interweaving of the inheritances of Jerusalem and Athens and Rome, undertaken by the Christian church from the very beginning of its existence. Christianity took the best of those predecessor cultures and produced a new thing, rooted in biblical revelation, in the dignity of the human person, in rationality, in law, in social solidarity, all under the aegis of the incarnation of Christ, which for them touched every aspect of human existence. The church fathers and medieval scholars studied the three ancient traditions, brought them into dialogue, and formed them into a coherent whole. They took literally the image of John 19:20. That passage describes the title affixed to the top of the cross of Christ. Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, written in Hebrew and in Greek and in Latin. I heard a couple years ago someone suggested Avengers Infinity War was the greatest crossover event of all time. I really think that this might give it a run for its money. Those three cultures and languages were united in a real way at that very fraught moment. The axial point of human history, one that showed forth the absolute worst in human nature, the new beginning was made possible. The beginning would see the three cultures fused, not in condemnation this time, but rather in defense of Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Harmony, then, is the very lifeblood of the Western project. It was through Jewish people confessing the Messiah in the midst of a Roman political order and writing and preaching in the Koine Greek of the Eastern Mediterranean that the life of Christendom and of the West as a whole came to take root. The new Christians did not reject what had come before. Rather, they embraced it and transformed it. Orthodox Christians did not disdain the Hebrew Scriptures, as some early heretics wanted. Rather, they received them, reading Christ on every page. With these Scriptures, they immersed themselves in a tradition of monotheism, ethical righteousness, linear history, and cultic worship that would fundamentally transform our world. Nor did Christianity spurn the wisdom of the Greeks. Indeed, in the centuries before Christ, the Jewish tradition had been engaging with Gentile thought, as can be seen in the Bible's wisdom literature. Paul models this himself when he preaches in the Greeks' own language and idiom to them on the Areopagus. John couches his gospel in soaring philosophical language that would have rung in the ears of the early Platonic philosophers. Later thinkers like Justin Martyr, Origen, Cappadocians, Augustine did not disdain to employ the wisdom of the ancients and elided the wisdom of the Greeks with the higher teachings of Christ. Neither did Christians reject Rome, though it was under her authority that Christ had been killed. Using their roads, their cities, their legal rights, the freedom they offered, the Christians spread the gospel message. Roman virtue, ethics, practicality, and law appealed to the early Christians, and after legalization, so did Roman administration. The medieval world would take this synthesis. They would augment it, taking in knowledge of other ancient worlds mediated through Jewish and Muslim philosophers to make it a part of the Western patrimony. They're like Christianity in the West is at one and the same time Hebrew and Greek and Roman. They are these three things essentially like the legs of a stool. To remove one or the other would be caught to cause the whole structure to collapse. That this is so is because of the medieval synthesis. Let's start with law. The Romans, that eminently practical people. I often like to say the Romans practiced what the Greeks preached. They specialized in pursuits like engineering and legal study. By the time of the Emperor Justinian, the Romans had created the most substantive body of law in history, one that came to be immortalized in the code and in the institutes. Now, since this law was promulgated in the remaining Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, the Greek half, at first it did not obtain in the West. Early Western legal practice was a combination of various tribal codes and customary law. There continued to be these, but they were supplemented increasingly by the sophisticated and the first international law, the canon law of the Roman Catholic Church. In the 11th century, though, Roman law began to filter back into the West, displacing the admittedly inferior national tribal codes that came before. This had a marked effect among political leaders. Being created in Byzantium, a highly streamlined bureaucratic society which vested authority in a supreme, near-divine emperor, the leaders of the West were naturally intrigued. Conceptions such as what pleases the prince as the rule of law, as the force of law, were music to their ears. But such absolutism was foreign to Western politics, whose leaders were quite limited in their ability to exercise authority. The new Roman law, which was superior to existing codes, presented a challenge to the existing course of political evolution in the West. The Western kingdoms, which claimed a nominal descent from the Roman Empire, were in fact successors of peoples that had emigrated from areas of Central Asia and Asia Minor during the first Christian centuries. They were the distant heirs of transitory groups like the Hittites and the Assyrians in the Old Testament. They were not Semitic speakers like those in Persia and Egypt and Palestine. Their traditions of political authority likewise differed. The Semitic political tradition manifested itself in centralized absolutism, investing their leaders with quasi-divine attributes. Groups like the Hittites and the Assyrians, on the other hand, were roving war bands, coalescing around a charismatic leader. Still dependent, though, on the other chiefs of tribes for their advice and consent, a phrase which should be pretty familiar to American constitutional scholars. The groups which migrated into Europe in late antiquity were governed like that as well. They had kings, but the authority of such leaders was hemmed in by other intermediate groups who later became transmuted into the aristocracy of medieval Europe. And this aristocracy existed in a symbiotic relationship with the kings. They derived title from the medieval rulers, who in turn depended on them for men and material supplied by the dukes and lords of the early medieval world. And as such, the kings were limited by the policies which their nobles would support. Remember, in medieval Europe, it's your count that votes. When kings tried to exceed such boundaries, nasty events like Magna Carta could occur. This is not the only check on power in medieval Europe. There they encountered a church which claimed not only independence from the political regime, but in light of its spiritual mission, a certain superiority. A king who opposed the dictates of the church, particularly in spiritual matters, was not likely to be successful. In pagan Rome, the emperor had not only been the supreme political authority, he was also the chief priest. To a certain extent, this conception remained, even after the coming of Christianity. Justinian's code expresses a concept of absolutism tinged with a divine sanction. For this reason, Eastern or Greek Christianity has always been characterized by a certain subservience to the state, which did not allow it often to challenge political authority. It was not so in the West. From very on, a concept of the authority of Christ's church on earth pervaded Latin Christianity. The extent of this can be shown by comparing two different time periods. The first one, in the 320s, Christians were still being brutally persecuted by the empire, yet a mere 60 years later, around the year 380, we meet a Christian bishop named Ambrose, standing in the door of his cathedral, barring entrance to none other than Theodosius, the emperor of Rome. Theodosius had been excommunicated for unjustly executing prisoners of war. Ambrose excommunicated him for this and refused him entrance into the church until he did penance. Astonishingly, the leader of the known world accepted Ambrose's remonstrance, did penance, and was readmitted to the church. Things had certainly changed. The second example comes from Pope Gelasius I in the 490s. Inspired by St. Augustine's vision in the City of God, he laid down what came to be known as the Gelasian doctrine. Gelasius distinguished two spheres of authority, the earthly power of kings and the sacred power of the Church of God. The power of the church is superior because it has a spiritual mission that echoes into eternity, while kings have a merely earthly mission to administer peace and justice. Now, though the church was superior in certain fields, that did not mean it could impinge on properly political authority. Kings were free to govern in their own territories. However, they still had to honor the church, and particularly to honor the moral law. This effective separation between church and state was key to how the Western world developed. Though fought over, litigated, challenged, this separation of the spheres and the division of authority provided a significant space where new political forms could be established and where concepts of individual and corporate liberty could be worked out. The final check on the power of kings was the sanctity of custom. In our hyper-regulated world, we forget how significant and important unwritten custom is. Custom is the assembled wisdom of generations who have faced similar challenges, overcome them, and have bequeathed the solutions to us. Custom, though unwritten, has for humans the force of codified law. In a society before widespread literacy, customary law, kept in the common memory, was the foundation of civil society. Indeed, even in the age of written law, the medievals came up with an adage that still applies, at least theoretically. Custom is the best interpreter of law. Even written law, then, must be seen in the light of received custom. When a king came to power in the Middle Ages, one of the key aspects of the coronation ritual was that he had to swear to maintain inviolate the customs that were then in practice in his kingdom. This customary law was the great privilege and benefit of the lower classes of medieval Europe. To give a hypothetical example, my father and grandfather fished in this pond. You cannot take away my right to do the same. So it should be clear at this point is how limited authority was in the Middle Ages. It's encapsulated by the motto of the traditionalist Carlist order in Spain in the 19th century. Dios, patria, fueros, rey. God, the fatherland, the customs, the king. In that order. It is well to underscore this. There was no absolute monarchy in the Middle Ages. In the Western Latin Middle Ages, centralized power was weak. Authority was distributed and many participated in government. To look for absolutism, we have to go to the early modern period. To sovereigns like the Tudors and Stuarts or Louis XIV of France. Only after the church, the nobility, and the commons had been neutralized by the 17th century was a concept of absolutism possible in the West. It was then that the concept of a unitary nation state was truly born. Yet, in light of the medieval limitation, remember that Roman law that's coming back. How are they going to solve this? How is something so procedurally superior, with such a good pedigree, to be reconciled with this limited conception of authority? If what pleases the prince has the force of law, what of the rights of the aristocracy? The customs of the people, the claims of the church? The way in which the brilliant medieval lawyers, both canon and civil, solved this question was not by discarding either the Western tradition or Roman law. The answer they gave was animated by the medieval spirit of harmony. Deeply rooted in the medieval period was the concept of popular representation. Some, heedless of history, think that such ideas arose only in the Enlightenment. Yet by that time, the principle of such representation had been established in every nation of Latin Europe for nearly a millennium. Periodically, there would be assemblies of all of the orders, the clergy, the nobility, the townsmen, the commons. In France, these orders were known as the Three Estates. Their assembly, therefore, came to be known as the Estates General. This vibrant medieval institution saw its powers stripped by the rise of absolutism in the 16th and 17th centuries, falling into desuetude for 150 years until its final summoning in revolutionary 1789. This legislature's failure was due to the early modern fetish for absolutism and centralization, and not to medieval, robust models of political participation, by then long abandoned. In German lands, great assemblies called diets were convened by the emperors, who sought the support and consensus of the various peoples. In Spain, the institution was known as the Cortes. In Poland, the same. In Scandinavian countries, it went by the entertaining title of the Thing. Most notable among these was the Althing of Iceland, the oldest extant representative body in the world. The Althing met once a year, and men from all over the island would come to have disputes heard and settled, and to hear an individual known as the law speaker recite from memory all of the collected customary law of Iceland. Surprisingly, the British Parliament did not develop until somewhat later, though it was through this institution that America would receive so much of its political wisdom and tradition. Yet, by the time of the rediscovery of Roman law, such institutions were already old and venerable. How then could they be squared with these new concepts of centralizing authority? The problem seemed relatively intractable until the ingenious medieval scholars got to work. As they studied the law code, they encountered new ideas about property, about business and taxation, about the organization of society. They did not simply passively accept such rules. They interacted with the code in a creative manner. At one point, they encountered a seemingly minor section of the laws that discussed who was entitled to water rights over rivers and streams. If you're familiar with the Mountain West of the United States, you know that such laws still today are critical for survival. The Roman lawyers had settled upon a logical maxim: quod omnes tangit ab omnibus approbare debeat. That which touches all ought to be approved by all. That is to say, what happens upstream affects what happens downstream. So the downstream people ought to have a say in what happens further up the watercourse. A logical legal inference in itself. What the medievals did with it was nothing less than astonishing. In this maxim, they formulated a justification for the limitation of power that was inherent in their various representative systems. When applied broadly, this principle of the Roman law would serve as a check on what had appeared to be absolute and arbitrary rule by the prince. The quod omnes tangent doctrine became a cornerstone of Western legal culture, elevated from an obscure injunction about water rights into one of the foundations of our Western political order. What, the legis puzzle, was so like water in our political lives? What was of such pitch and moment that it could affect the life of the whole community? Certainly the king had a right to rule, to appoint, to fire, to make laws not prejudicial to the estates. But were there not things beyond his sole competence, things which would affect the whole community most intimately? And as the Middle Ages wore on, they boiled these down to two instances, where, because they affected the whole of the community, the consent of the whole community had to be obtained. These were war and taxes. The king had no right to make decisions on such things without consulting the representatives of the community. If he wanted everyone to pay, he had to ask. If he wanted everyone to fight, he had to consult. These became so embedded in our legal culture that whole wars were fought over them. For example, the English Civil War of the 1640s. And they're even present as constitutional principles in our own republic. Notice that the president cannot raise taxes. He must ask Congress. And further notice, what house has the authority to pass money bills? Not the Senate, but the House of Representatives. Since taxation touches all, it is the House with direct proportional representation that such bills must arise. Neither, in theory, can presidents go to war of their own volition. He must ask Congress, though presidents of both parties have found clever ways around that for the past 70 years or so. Something I suggest is inimical to the brilliant political theories bequeathed to us by the medieval and British political traditions. It was the British Parliament of the 17th century and the American founders of the 18th who recovered these practices, rather than creating them anew. To continue on the concept of law, numerous other critical breakthroughs were achieved in medieval Europe that prove fundamental for our own American experience. It is due to the medieval schoolmen, in particular St. Thomas Aquinas, that we owe the adaptation and streamlining of the concept of the natural law, by which is meant our participation in the eternal law of God. Drawing on the traditions of the Greeks, and in particular that of the Roman Cicero, Thomas wove together a concept of natural law also rooted in Christian revelation, notably Romans chapters 1 and 2, which speaks of the Gentiles doing by nature that which the law commands. Independent of various specific conclusions he reaches, the establishment of natural law as an outflow of God's divine nature was critical to understanding two things. In the first place, it meant that the natural law was unchangeable and universal, common to all people at all times. If unjustified homicide was wrong, it was wrong always and everywhere, no matter the period or the culture. It is not simply a social convention that can be changed by majority vote. It is absolute. From this flows the second consideration. Natural law is apart from and superior to the law of the state. The state can and should frame its written law in the light of natural law. Indeed, civil laws against murder are strengthened by their flowing from the natural law. The reverse of this implies that if a state tries to frame a positive law against the natural law, for instance, if the state tries to legislate that to willfully murder an innocent human being is legal, then such a law is null and void, and may, indeed must, be actively resisted. This is precisely the argument that Martin Luther King made from the Birmingham jail against the laws of segregation, and he appealed to whom? To Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas. I will not obey these laws because they are unjust. Just because it's on the law books does not make it just. As Augustine had said, a state without justice is nothing more than a band of brigands. It also means that the state can legitimately legislate for a diversity of peoples. If the prince legislates that murder is illegal, that means not just for Christians, but for Jews, for Muslims, for atheists. Natural law is common to all and does not depend on religious profession. To murder a man is wrong, not because the civil law says it's wrong, It is wrong because he is a man. And this conception dovetailed with one of the greatest contributions of Christianity to world civilization. The idea of the dignity of all humans created in the image and likeness of God. Christian theorists, following the thought of St. Thomas in the 16th century, particularly in the school of Salamanca in Spain, would be the first ones to articulate concepts like universal human rights, or the idea that people are not to be enslaved simply because they differ in religion. Indeed, it was the Middle Ages that stamped out slavery in Europe, only to see it come in through the back door in early modern history outside the continent. When we speak of human rights today, if we speak of human rights today, we have Christianity to thank. It was the church that spread the idea of humans as ends in themselves and not means, created in the image and likeness of God, and not only that, but redeemed by a God who himself became a partaker of human common nature. To deprive a man of life and freedom was an affront to the Creator, who had endowed those gifts. It is useful to mention here that racism is entirely foreign to the pre-modern worldview. It was another early modern innovation, produced by the breakdown of a Christian view of a common rational human nature. In light of the collapse of this vision, we are today in a situation where ethics is not regulated by nature and dignity. What remains is only power. This is a precarious position in which to find ourselves. If power relations are the only thing governing human action, then racism and ethnocentrism can be considered entirely valid viewpoints and acquire their legitimacy based solely on the groups or individuals who hold power. I think Christians rejected this. All were created by God. The concept of harmony required both the equality of creation and baptism to be recognized, while at the same time affirming the goodness of certain forms of inequality, of talent, of position, of intellect, all as being part of the intrinsic natural order willed by God. Modern systems radically oversimplify reality, and so embrace either utter equality contrary to reason, or inequality contrary to justice. It was the medievals who held them both in fruitful and necessary tension. Thomas's idea of natural law can be pushed further. It demands that the state recognize higher and more essential institutions. This is not meant to detract from the authority of the state in worldly matters, but to serve as a moral check should the state begin to stray. It underscores the ancient insight of Aristotle that society is built not upon the state, but upon an institution prior and superior to it, the family. Now, this is markedly different from modern conceptions of the origins of political rights. That's true. In the post-Lockean world, society is created by a free compact of individuals who enter into a contract. Locke's concept of society, too, would have been foreign to the pre-modern world, be it pagan, Christian, Jewish, or Muslim. Aristotle begins his politics with one of his rare romantic moments, and for those familiar with reading Aristotle, it is maybe his only romantic moment. Society begins with the love of a man for a woman, who, entering marriage, beget a family. Such families unify into tribes, which combine to form states. The communal origin of society is at the heart of the Western political tradition, the pre-modern Western tradition. While it is true that Christianity elevates immeasurably the position of the individual, it stops short of saying that the individual is the irreducible atom of society. An individual in the pre-modern world only acquired identity by membership in groups, marriages, families, guilds, confraternities, churches. The kind of organization that Tocqueville said was absolutely critical to the flourishing of American society. In contemporary society, the medieval harmony between community and individual, both as intrinsic and irreducible components of who we are, has been shattered. On one hand, we have those who exalt individuality to the detriment of the common good. Think in this sense of Lockean libertarianism. On the other hand, we have those who would destroy the individual in the name of the whole, such as statist socialism. Modern problems arise from creating simplistic answers and rejecting the necessity of both individual and common goods to the achievement of a stable and healthy society. Since there was a common human nature, there could be a common idea of the laws of nations. Because of the reality of sin, medievals realized it was inevitable that there would be wars. Yet even wars must be conducted by taking into account human dignity. It was the Catholic Church in the 10th and 11th centuries that was the first to lay down ground rules for combat. She prescribed that all clergy, peasants, and women be excluded from war, making armed conflict into a pursuit of noblemen alone. That meant that a large medieval battle would be no more than 2,000 or 3,000 people. Fortunately, we've become very progressive and allow millions to fight, face each one another, and be slaughtered. I'm very proud of this. She also legislated about the treatment of prisoners of war and the types of weapons that could be used. Using her moral authority, she persuaded nobles that they were not to wage war on Sundays or feast days. Then she banned war in Lent and Advent. And by the 12th century, the church had restrictions on fighting, limiting it from Monday night to Wednesday morning. Tuesday was battle day in medieval culture. She enjoined peace on pain of excommunication. She liked spilling another Christian's blood to spilling the blood of Christ. The church forbade total warfare against whole economies, warfare aimed at the innocent. Indeed, many of the injunctions of the medieval church have survived to the present day and are incorporated in the Geneva Conventions. The church promoted the Augustinian concept of just war, a war that is essentially defensive, limited in objective, and waged in a just manner. And these principles themselves have animated American policy to a greater or lesser extent. Indeed, in my opinion, it would be difficult to find another nation that has not at least tried to engage in war in as just a manner as possible, particularly in recent conflicts. Now, many exceptions could be made to that, but it is clear America tries. Another innovation in the Middle Ages was the refinement of legal procedure. Faced with the remnants of paganism in the areas of oath-taking and trial by combat or by fire, by the 13th century, the church had forbidden superstitious recourse to questionable methods of determining guilt in order to focus on the evidence-based trials that are familiar to us. The first modern procedure for deposing witnesses and gathering evidence is a result of the tribunals that assessed the holiness and miracles of candidates for canonization. In the modern world, inquisition is another one of those terrible medieval words that evokes fear and loathing. Inquisitio is nothing other than the first modern legal process of gathering evidence, a name which is still used in countries following the civil law and which is a precursor to our own grand jury system. Confronted with the specter of popular violence against suspected heretics, the church instituted inquisitions in order to respect the legal rights of the accused and to save them from lynch mobs. While civil inquisitorial procedure is unfamiliar to those of us in the American and British traditions, it is a venerable legal system still in use in much of the world. Our jury system is a result of many developments, particularly those arising out of English common law. The concept of a jury of one's peers drawn from one's own social class to assess guilt or innocence is a medieval English custom. It is also considered by thinkers like de Tocqueville as our fundamental introduction to the rule of law and government. It is a shame today that jury duty is seen as an odious task to be avoided as possible, when in reality it forms the backbone of our legal system. It was also the Christian church that invented the idea of prisons for rehabilitation. In the ancient world, very often, and the medieval secular world, very often the penalty for any crime was either death or enslavement. The Christian world drastically curtailed the first and worked to eliminate the second. Guided by her twin mandate of mercy and justice, the church desired not the death of a sinner, but his conversion and reintegration into the community. So the church invented the system we have today: confinement in justice and penance in mercy. with the hope of eventual healing. The effect of medieval canon law in our contemporary legal system is undeniable and extensive. And all of this leads to a final point about the Western legal tradition: the supremacy of the rule of law. In the Middle Ages, the kings were systematically limited from arrogating authority themselves. If they exceeded that mandate, they could be excommunicated by the church, forced to sign things like Magna Carta, face rebellions like from the peasantry, such as the Wat Tyler Rebellion of 1381. The law is supreme, and no one, not even the king, is above the law. For indeed it is God who is above the king. A king who violated the law could be legitimately and justly deposed, as many German emperors were by popes in the Middle Ages, and as the British Parliament argued in 1640 and 1688, and as the Americans themselves were famously to suggest in 1776. Properly understood, Christianity is the enemy of earthly absolutism, and is a defender and protector of individual rights and dignity. But that doesn't end the legacy of the American project for the medievals. Not only did the Middle Ages abhor absolutism, within it one could find examples of representative government, republican governments, and even the first and only democratic communes since the time of ancient Greece among the city-states of Italy. In those small cities, in addition to those on the coast of Flanders, astonishing developments took place. Not only did they pioneer a type of Christian democracy, which was to have such an effect on Europe and America in the post-war 20th century, but it was there that all the various tools of capitalism were deployed and developed. This was necessary in order to efficiently distribute the bumper crops produced by the Second Agricultural Revolution. 500 years before Adam Smith penned The Wealth of Nations, towns like Venice, Pisa, Florence, Genoa were deploying technologies necessary for what came to be called the commercial revolution. We see money changers evolving into bankers, taking to part deposits. We see the innovation of letters of credit so that travel could be made safe, so profits could be retained. Such deposits not only enabled the extension of loans, but the creation of systems of credit, allowing the deployment of capital in ways before undreamed of. In the seafaring towns of Italy, double entry bookkeeping and insurance was pioneered. The pooling of resources that would later be called joint stock companies enabled entrepreneurs to finance larger and larger projects that led to a virtuous cycle of wealth creation, which I would say has not yet even quite run its course. Therefore, the systems of international trade and the practice of capitalism that later made the United States a force to be reckoned with was entirely in place by the medieval period. Indeed, one of the dirty secrets of economic history was that the Spanish Thomistic theologians in the 1500s not only outlined the theory of capitalism 200 years before Adam Smith, theirs was more comprehensive. Advanced studies in economics and many other fields would not have been possible had not the medieval church invented the university. That institution which through many challenges has survived and thrived into our current day. The colleges that we all hail from are direct descendants of their medieval exemplars in places like Paris and Bologna. Even after the Reformation, Protestants still embraced the university system as places like Yale, Harvard, and Princeton were established so that Americans could receive an education that could approximate their European counterparts. The university system survived a turn away from religion and towards practical study in the 19th and 20th century. Some would say that juries may be still out on that. It has proven to be one of the most flexible innovations bequeathed by the medieval world. And though it may come as a total surprise, because we're in Alabama, for 800 years, the University of Paris has not had a football team. Somehow they managed to continue to educate students. These medieval universities were born of a burning desire for wisdom and a love of learning. They increased literacy so significantly that it was estimated in an average Italian city-state of the 1200s, at least 50% of the adult men could read. This is an astonishing figure in an age before print, indeed one not approached in the United States until the turn of the 20th century. The universities also reveled in the medieval task of harmonic integration. The first great code of canon law, compiled by the monk Gratian in 1140, was entitled The Harmony of Discordant Canons. It was so well done and finely balanced it remained the law of the Catholic Church until 1917. Similar were the many summaries of the humanities, of philosophy, of religion, compiled by hundreds of academic scholars. Most famous of these were the Summa Theologiae, of St. Thomas. Thomas sought to organize and systematize the data of revelation, bringing it into harmony with reason. Some have characterized the outline of the Summa as being similar to the structure of a perfectly harmonious architecture of contemporary Gothic cathedrals. It was this insistence on the constance between faith and reason that prepared the foundations of the scientific revolution. Bolstered by the Aristotelian doctrine of the reliability of the senses, coupled with the conviction that there was only one truth, empirical science suddenly becomes a worthwhile endeavor. God has created the universe in an ordered way. Since God himself is subsistent reason, then revelation and reason must of necessity go together. As St. Augustine had argued, quote, "Don't believe for a moment that God hates the very quality in us by which he has raised us above the animals. God does not want us to think he is preventing us from searching and finding out the meanings of things. Work to understand with your whole heart." The dissonance between faith and reason is a legacy not of the Middle Ages, but of the conditions of the 18th and 19th centuries. In 1765, John Adams wrote a dissertation on the canon and feudal law, in which he called them, quote, "the two greatest sources of tyranny in human history." Like many after him, he was using medieval myths to attack contemporary problems, in his case, the Stamp Act. He condemned what he did not fully understand. As Adam Gopnik said, quote, "The light obtained by setting straw men on fire is not what we mean by illumination." A more balanced historical consideration would demonstrate that the rights he asserted so strongly were only being challenged by the rise of modern statist absolutisms, and were rather given birth to by the society which he mistakenly denounced. In the end, we can see how the deep roots of the American project ramify into the fertile soil of the Middle Ages. It was in that period the Christian project wove together Hebrew and Greek and Roman into an organic whole and gave birth to the West as a comprehensive idea. There's one word I want you to remember about the Middle Ages. It's harmony. During this period, the great Romanesque and Gothic churches soared upwards to the heavens. It was within those churches, notably the great Church of Notre Dame, which today still stands, having survived iconoclasm, revolution, and fire, that the first strands of polyphonic music rang out. In the 1100s, the great masters Leonin and Perotin began to experiment with multi-voice music that laid the groundwork for Palestrina and Bach, Mozart, and Beethoven. Great summaries of men like Gratian and Thomas were cathedrals in words, harmonizing the wisdom of the world, so that, though we are still darkened morally by sin, we can still be enlightened by the shining light of reason and revelation. Standing above this all was the medieval Catholic idea that the human person could be reintegrated and made whole again in the grace of Christ. With that grace, their whole being, body and soul, mind, emotions, passions could come back into harmony, finally achieving that great balance that Socrates called sophrosune. All of that leads to the stirring conclusion of the Divine Comedy, where Dante describes his vision of ordered, harmonic perfection that is the Godhead in heaven. Quote, "Except that then my mind was struck by lightning, through which my longing was at last fulfilled. Here powers failed my high imagination. But now my desire and will were turned, like a balanced wheel, rotated evenly, by the love that moves the sun and the other stars." Thank you very much. Any questions or comments? I appreciate your kind attention.
I have some of the online audience. First, yes.
I know, I think we should let the online people have the first
Oh,
one.
I had a question.
Okay, so George, and then, yeah. George, go ahead.
What's the natural law view of capital punishment by the state?
Well, the state, natural law says that a private individual has no right to take a life. at all. That's only given to someone who has care of a community. And so an individual has a right to self-defense, but because individuals and communities are both important, a community has a right to self-defense as well. And so it is possible to argue that the one who has care of such a community, in order to prevent a mortal danger from within that community, that one could have recourse in certain circumstances, capital punishment.
Yeah, forgive me if you've kind of touched on this, but I was just kind of wondering, how does it kind of correlate, or how does it make sense that for, let's say the Christian church, to see everyone as one of God's children, yet how does that correlate with someone who isn't religious or is not Christian? How do you kind of...
Well, I mean, it starts with all humans are created in the image and likeness of God, and therefore are of inestimable and infinite value in that sense. For that reason, they cannot be compelled in conversion to the faith. But besides that, the Catholic Church, the Christian Church, also teaches that the only access to the kind of supernatural grace that's going to lead to salvation is through Christ. And so it preaches both things at the same time.
But through the creation of what you said is the prison of rehabilitation, part of that was confirmation or becoming Christian, was it not?
No, it was never, because the Inquisition of the Catholic Church never claimed any authority over anyone who was not baptized, and therefore was only within the church. So the courts of the Inquisition had no authority over Jews or Muslims at any time within its life. And so those who were confined in there had been baptized Catholics at some point. Yes, sir.
So I think I had two questions. It depends on how the first one's answered. So I want to make sure I understand. So is this thesis more that it's Western civilization and medieval times that sort of set up boundaries to prevent absolutism in regards to political power, or are you saying more that the church in those times was the leading force doing that?
It's the church. My argument is the church that creates Western civilization through the amalgamation of the three ancient cultures. And those ancient cultures do not always prevent absolutism. I mean, there's not necessarily anything within Old Testament Judaism which would prevent absolutism. And we know that there's the Roman law actively encourages absolutism. And so it would have to come from a much more dynamic synthesis of what comes from those when added to the Christian tradition that leads to a diminution. And also the contribution of those various new peoples that come into Europe between the 4th and 7th centuries and their traditions and their customs.
Okay, then
The church uses those too in its attempt to limit absolutes.
So that does my second question.
Mhm.
So given that the Christian church now, still being somewhat of an amalgamation of Jerusalem, Rome, and the others, how does that view, or does it relate to the papacy being, because obviously in a sense the Pope has, if you want to say absolute, I don't like saying that, but if you want to say absolute power, but he does have a relationship with other, I guess, brother bishops or patriarchs or whatever. How do those two ideas relate? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, that's a complicated question, because what you're talking about is within the church, within the spiritual realm of the church, and not necessarily the political relations that I was talking about. So the idea of the Middle Ages is that the two are separate, but ought to cooperate with one another. The Pope, in terms of the church, does have absolute dispositive power over the governance of the church. I mean, he doesn't have power over revelation, but in terms of governance and jurisdiction, he has power.
Yeah, I think,
Yeah, so there's a distinction between ad intra within the church and in its relationships with the broader political powers.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yes, sir.
Well, that's it. Given the fact that, as you mentioned during the Middle Ages, that the church held that in the political realm with kings, they had boundaries they couldn't cross because the church dictated, their direction. How do you get to the point where then you have ideas like Hobbes, where the state, the sovereign controls both the scepter and the sword, essentially? So religious and political power. Where does the church really play a role in there when the sovereigns are essentially assuming the role of both?
Yeah, not much. I mean, in England, the church has been made subservient to the state in Anglicanism. And so the same thing essentially happens in France with Gallicanism, with the Catholic Church in France. what the process of the 15th to the 17th century is among the monarchs of Europe is clearing away other sources of authority, other sources of power. And only when they clear those away, as I said, the church, the independent power of the church, the independent power of the aristocrats, the power of the towns and the commons, once they get rid of those, only then are we able to make. And then Hobbes sees that and he makes that into a theory of absolutes.
Thank you.
Mhm. Yeah, you want to try some on?
Yeah, let's try some on. Eric asks, since natural law is natural to all humanity, can you recommend any good non-Christian traditions that testify to natural law and human rights that are worth knowing about?
Yeah, I mean, I would point to Confucianism right away. I think Confucianism, in his account of virtues, except for a couple areas, I mean, is going to parallel the Aristotelian concept of the virtues very strongly. If you want to, and like I said, the concept of the natural law stretches back to the Greek pagans, the Greek and Roman pagans. And so it is not something proper to Christianity. It's something that Christianity takes, a pre-existing condition. And in fact, when the Jesuits arrived in China in the 16th, 17th century, they dovetailed with Confucianism very, very quickly, maybe a little bit too quickly for some judgments. But they say we take what's good in these civilizations, and then that's reinforced by scriptural evidence in Romans 1 and 2. And they say, wow, this really seems to dovetail. What Aristotle said, what Cicero said, what Romans 1 and 2 said, that all of a sudden there seems to be this tradition. And you can see it anthropologically too. For instance, in universal taboo against parent-child incest, you can see traces of the natural law in many different cultures, though law is expressed very differently and uniquely in a lot of different places, a lot of different times.
Oswald asked, how is it that today there is never a mention about the medievals and political philosophy courses, especially such as the Spaniard schools?
Mm-hmm.
Which I would say, here at JSU,
I know, JSU.
the medievals.
You've got it taken care of here at JSU. No, we've got it back on the right track. That's why I could go on to another mission. I fulfilled my mission here. I go on and enlighten other places after. No, we've had very many good professors here that have known this quite apart from me. This has been a tendency, and I would say it starts in the Enlightenment. To a certain extent, you can point to the Renaissance, but that was more of a rhetorical move. In the Enlightenment, however, there comes to be the idea that the entire world went to sleep after Cicero was killed, and then one day Machiavelli was born. And the rest of the stuff that happened for 1,500 years really has no part in the story. And that was due to cultural prejudices, that was due to religious prejudices, it was due to rhetorical prejudices from the Renaissance. And so that is something that, for instance, Joseph Schumpeter had to do this. He had to totally rewrite the history of economic thought when people finally realized that, wow, Adam Smith wasn't really original, really at all, because the Spanish, the problem with the Spanish Thomists of the 16th century is, well, they had a bunch of problems. They were priests, they were Catholic, they wrote in Latin. You know, they're not English, they're not Englishmen, and so therefore they're not worthy of attention. And so I think there's been a much greater appreciation among scholars, certainly in nearly every field, of the renewed contributions and the continuities rather than the disjunctions that were formerly taught as normal. Yes, Dr. Beasley.
Can I follow up on that? Was Smith reading these Spanish Thomists? Is there any evidence that he was aware of them at all, or?
No, for instance, much of Jefferson's discussions of popular sovereignty, much of it can be traced back to St. Robert Bellarmine, a Catholic cardinal, who was in controversy with King James VI, or King James I of England. King James I wanted to claim absolutism. Cardinal Bellarmine, a Jesuit, was defending popular representation. And so through him, Robert Filmer, who is Locke's big interlocutor, Robert Filmer is fighting against Bellarmine. So what they're getting is second and third hand. Sometimes people call this the hidden Thomism of Protestant Europe in the 17th and 18th century. The Thomas is everywhere, but he's nowhere named. Yes?
I want to ask, you mentioned the text on economics that the Spanish institution wrote. What were some, sorry, I got my words ahead of me. You mentioned that they were a lot more comprehensive than Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. What were some concepts that they covered that Smith didn't?
I would refer you almost entirely to John Mueller's Redeeming Economics. He talks about classical economics only covering two of the necessary inputs for the economic, and this is over my head, that's why I'm pointing you to this book. But if you go to John Mueller's Redeeming Economics, he will lay out, why he calls it AAA economics. It's Augustine, Aristotle, and Aquinas. That they are the ones that because they have a much clearer picture of the wholeness of the human person than Enlightenment era, Scottish Enlightenment had.
Another question.
Yes.
The research you have done into this specific area of study, do you believe that there is a correlation between the erosion of people's faith, Judeo-Christian traditions, and the decline of the United States specifically?
Well,
Is it only going to work as long as those rules are respected?
Well, I mean, you have that quote from John Adams that is so famous, we have a constitution built for a moral, religious people who will fit no other. And there's certainly a characteristic, and that goes to education, which what I'm more familiar with, right? They were liberally educated people. They knew their Roman history, they knew their scriptures, they knew all these things. Many of our students are entirely divorced from those sources, which animated the people that created the Constitution because of that. Yeah, and so anytime you're cut off from a base tradition, and I'm saying just on a secular level, I'm not even making any sort of claims of faith. If America was founded within this deeply Christian context, Protestant Christian, and if it's cut off from that, then you're going to have difficulty understanding where it's coming from and where it's going. So just from a observer's perspective. I thought you were going to go somewhere different with that, because I was going to actually put in a plug for non-Christian scholarship. It's really in the last 50 years where you have people who are doing scholarship who are not invested in the confessional identity. That is, they're not Protestant scholars primarily or Catholic scholars primarily. There are people who may even be indifferent to religion, but what that allows them to do is to look at these things in the past and say, well, let's scrape away the prejudices on either side, and let's actually access what the data is. Let's actually look at the sources. Let's actually assess it on its own recognizance. And that's actually enabled a lot of the things that I'm talking about to come to the fore. And so that's, in some senses, not the sense you were talking about, but in some senses that's been useful, to say the very least. Yes, sir.
All right, so forgive me if you covered this, but do you believe that, in your opinion, that the renewed interest in philosophy and natural sciences in the 16th century, with the Reformation and the Renaissance, kind of led to the shunning of the entirety of the Middle Ages? So you mentioned how, nowadays we view the medieval ages, as barbaric, as everyone is just farmers, yada yada yada. Do you believe that everyone's interest in sciences and philosophy in the 1600 time led to that?
Yeah, I totally dispute the first half of that assertion, that all of a sudden there was a renewed interest in philosophy and natural science in the 16th century. It was there throughout the Middle Ages. All right, it wasn't Francis Bacon in the 17th century who came up with the scientific method. It was Roger Bacon, a Franciscan friar in the 13th century. It was Albertus Magnus who was doing experiments, scientific experiments. It was breakthroughs in mathematics and optics in the 13th and 14th century in economic science and philosophy. Boy, they had philosophy going throughout that entire period. What happens in the 16th century is a series of radical cultural breaks. If you want to look to a rejection of philosophy, you'd have to look to the Protestant side of the Reformation for that. All right, that's a rejection of natural law. That's a rejection of natural philosophy, natural theology, in favor of a reliance on Scripture. Right, and that's logical within its own world. I understand that appeal. But then you have a divorce in the 16th century between natural science and philosophy. After Descartes, you get into a period of philosophy that's entirely idealist, whereas at the same time, the scientists are going in an entirely empirical direction. And so you have this great divorce between philosophy and science, which hasn't been healed to the present day, which was not present in the Middle Ages either. So I push that back a little bit more. Yes, ma'am.
So my question has to do with natural law, and this is more of the, early modern period, because I'm talking about the colonial period. I am curious if, racism and subjugation is antithetical to natural law, which is endorsed by the Catholic Church wholeheartedly. How then does the Church justify the use of Scripture to subjugate and destroy native culture in the US. Like there's this, there's not the same synthesis as there was, say, in China with Confucianism and
Right.
scripture. Why is that?
And first of all, you have to specify whom, because I'm afraid a lot of, particularly British colonists, were reading a lot more Locke than they were scripture at the time that they were displacing Native Americans in that sense. And so they weren't mixing their labor with the land. We were going to, and so we had just title to it in that sense. And so that is not something, because and you would have to look at each different colonial power separately, and you have to look at the condition of the relations between church and state in Spain, in France, and in whatever colonial power you're talking about, and try to get the details on the ground in order to understand it. But from a broad-based perspective, there's never been universal Catholic toleration or subjugation of peoples. That's just not part of the story. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, in regard to the labor and land, can you go into that a little bit more? Because do you mean that from a Lockean perspective, or do you mean from your personal perspective?
Which is, say that's at the beginning of your sentence.
Saying like labor and land, like
Mhm.
you were talking about that. In regards to that, are you saying from a Lockean perspective, or are you saying just in general?
From a Lockean perspective, right? The idea of mixing the labor with the land. Because the 16th century Spanish said these people have, by natural law, title to this land. They have title to the land, and that's not something that Locke, because he rejects the concept of natural law that would be described in that way, would accept. So, yeah, I'm asserting it, but I think Locke says it. I think I can find it in Locke. Yes.
I might have missed this, but how would you, personally, how do you think everybody should define natural law so we can observe that?
Natural law is that which contributes to the fulfillment of who I am as the kind of thing I am. All right, so if I'm a human, first of all, I have to understand what a human is, and I have to understand what a human is for, and what a human is directed to, and from there I can begin to draw more particular conclusions using reason from the various forms of human flourishing and the various types of goods that humans pursue. And so you need some heavy lifting in philosophy. Now, fortunately, a lot of that heavy lifting has been done to us. It's just done for us, but people don't read it. People aren't understood. Yes.
The second part of that, would you say that that's more figured out for everybody or more objective, to each person?
More objective, or what's
more objective, or is it like applied to most everybody?
Well, see, it depends on where you are in the natural law. The very first principles of the natural law apply universally to everyone. As you get to more and more particular conclusions, these can vary across time and place. These can vary according to culture. Like, for instance, what level cousin you can marry. Right? Incest is absolutely forbidden by the natural law, but when you're talking about, if you've ever cracked open a 19th century English novel, literally everyone's marrying their first cousin. It's just what you do. And in that country, the particular conclusion of the natural law could have been that this is a legitimate outworking of society's, rules on marriage. Yes.
In your previous question, you touched upon the Protestant Reformation for a bit. Can you open the detail, because you mentioned how it was a series of social breaks.
Mm-hmm.
Can you elaborate on that for me?
The Protestant Reformation?
Yeah, how it broke down, like how you mentioned, what the exact term?
Well, you have a large-scale rejection of the unaided power of human reason to reach valid conclusions. Mm-hmm. You also have a large-scale rejection of the power of the human will to will the good in any case. And those are very, very different from historical Christianity, whether it's Catholic or Orthodox. And so that's a serious break. You also have very serious social breaks, if we're going to put on a Marxist hat for a minute, between social classes that are warring against one another in the 16th century. And then you have a disjunction between the political classes and the academic classes. Much of the Protestant Reformation, at least on the continent, was headed by academics, was headed by the academic classes, whereas in places like Scandinavia and England, it was a monarchical revolution against the church. So, when I said, I'm too much of a historian to make these really broad claims. You got to peer down closely and get in the weeds to figure it out. Let's do an online question.
Yeah. Ben May asked, it seems that in modern capitalism, there's a tendency for some people to become highly focused on career pursuits rather than family life. What do you think Aquinas would say about this modern notion of hyper-individualism? Has our society become too individualistic?
Well, Thomas would say with Socrates that he's not that terribly interested in what you do, he's more interested in who you are. And so if you can't answer that question, or if you dare to answer that question with "I am what I do," then you've entered into a very modern or even postmodern mindset. The pre-modern philosophy wants to ask the deeper questions about what is most truly significant in a human life. And one of my favorite quotes is cemetery. The cemetery is full of men who you can't do without them, right? Or of necessary men. I forget what's the phrase of people who thought themselves so absolutely critical to the ongoing function of their profession that they died, and guess what? Their profession just went right and going. Right? They weren't. Right? They weren't absolutely essential. So yeah. Mm-hmm.
Why do you think Thomas Aquinas' comprehensive synthesis had such an impact that it got adopted officially by the Church in 1917? Does it correlate on people wanting their own opinions expressed widely, or an unknown yearning for some ordered system that expresses their opinions?
Well, we certainly yearn for order. I think that's deeply built within the human person. The medievals recognized that very strongly. Thomas's philosophy and theology took a very long time to become, to obtain generally in the Catholic Church. And even today, no one in the Catholic Church is forced to be a Thomist. There are other theological and philosophical systems that one can adopt. I think that's a bad idea, but they certainly are free to do them. There's better systems and there's worse systems. All that the Code of Canon Law in 1917 says is that Thomism is a reliable system that ought to be taught in seminaries because of its been tried for 700 years and it's extremely good. If it was simply a compendium of opinions, Thomas himself wouldn't be interested in it at all. Much like Socrates says. Socrates says, I'm not here to banter about opinions, I'm here to try to find out the truth. And so they've got no time for opinions. Leave the opinions to the sophists. Yes?
It seems that America is able to,
yeah.
It seems like America is able to capture a lot of the medieval ideas, especially in terms of a limited government. Are we able to, or do you think that we'll be able to have the same kind of harmony without the role of the church? Because they seem to have recaptured these ideas, but kind of gone away in different, or gone about it in a different way. Is it possible to kind of achieve that same harmony in this alternate route we've taken?
If there's nothing in common, if there's no common agreement about the deepest things, about the most important things, then it's going to be terribly difficult to have a coherent society, cohesive society. And I don't necessarily mean that those are religious things, right? I mean, we could talk about the ancient Greek polis, all right, that unified people together around some civic duty or patriotism or something like that. And that could serve to unify a community as well. It's very difficult to see something that so transcends division today, right? That would usefully unify people. Because anytime that we see for a moment a glimmer of something that might provide a national unity, it's immediately grabbed upon as a moment to protest. Right now, I'm going to use this as a vehicle to protest. Right? In order, and they may be protesting very just things. They may be protesting unjust realities. But they take on those sort of glass shared remnants of unity and decide that we're going to use this as a moment for individual expression rather than any kind of communitarian orientation. And so if you become hyper-individualized, which is the whole purpose of the postmodern movement, then any type of national, civic, or political life is going to become really, really difficult to maintain. Mm-hmm.
This pairs well with a question from Mark, who asks, without the check of the church, is there anything to prevent the exponential growth of the nation state? Is a document like the U.S. Constitution strong enough to curb the growth of centralized power for long periods of time?
Yeah, it's very difficult because we have very telling examples of the unlimited growth of state power in the last 2 centuries to let us know how these things kind of go. And yeah, in the absence of many of those things, like I said, it may not be the church, but it could be shared moral values. It could be patriotism, a national, healthy nationalism of some sort. There's nothing to prevent the rise of demagogues. And the arrogation of power and increase of fascisms, both right and left.
Oswald asks, what is essentially the difference between natural law and natural rights? Do they always go hand in hand? If not, when do they deviate?
That's a really good question, and I'm not going to attempt to answer it here. Natural law would have been the language that would have been preferred by the ancients and the medievals, because it tends to refer the origin of natural law to God. That it's really God who has rights, and he has given us gifts to be able to enjoy. Whereas in the modern world, with the shift towards the individual, the rights become taken from God and start to get lodged into us. Now, many people of goodwill, many Catholic thinkers, consider that natural rights language is able to be salvaged, because essentially we're still talking about the same thing. So if there's a right to life, for instance, whether it's God granting life, therefore we don't take it away, or I have an inalienable individual right to life, it mostly means the same thing, right? But it involves a Copernican turn in our view of the human person that begins to lodge, sovereignty in us, as if we have control of the law that's possessed. And when it begins to slip out of that, that's why the turn to rights language is understandable, it's useful, but it's not entirely unproblematic. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for this talk. Especially thank you for mentioning Iceland and the thing. That's where my research is based, and I'm always glad to see them not.
Oh, love Iceland researchers. They're great.
Yes, it's wonderful. My question is, what do you see as the role of the modern university in all of this, especially in light of both it being one of the last institutions that can sort of trace its origins back to the medieval period, and also what you mentioned as the break between nature and philosophy?
Yeah, we have one of the last sort of medieval things going on here. We are a corporation, which is another medieval invention, by the way, the corporation. And because we come together for a common purpose, we're here with a common goal, we're unified as professors and students together towards a common end. As much as the university, if the university decides to become simply an adjunct of the modern administrative state, or if it becomes, simply a job training center of America, adjunct of corporate big business, it will utterly lose its ethos and will become totally useless in any attempt to thwart those kind of fascisms, totalitarianisms, or radical hyper-individualisms that I'm criticizing. So yeah, I don't have a other than here's a darn good example. Maybe we can learn stuff from them and read good books and things like that. Read good books with good people and have maybe some wine.
If you're willing to take 2 more questions from the online audience.
No.
I know. well, I think you find these 2 fitting because one, we can use the word incorrectly, right? Because whenever I hear about the Inquisition, especially the Spanish one, is portrayed as torture and persecution of non-Christians. Mm-hmm. Is this an accurate portrayal?
No. No one who was not Christian was ever prosecuted by the Spanish Inquisition. Now, I'm going to qualify that because in 1492 there was a mass expulsion of Jews and Muslims from Spain for very complicated and contextual reasons that were given the choice of either expulsion, take their movable goods with them, or conversion to the Catholic faith. Now, many of them chose to convert. And so because of that, they became under the jurisdiction of the Spanish Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition, because they were baptized, and because the Catholic Church believed in the grace of baptism and what it did to people, it entered into their jurisdiction in that case. Very similarly as Mexican Americans entered into American jurisdiction after the end of the Mexican-American War. So in that sense, there were some who were not, who would not maybe have considered themselves Christians, but the church did from their external acceptance of the Christian faith.
And final question. Can you recommend some readings for people who want to learn about natural law and how it relates to St. Thomas Aquinas?
Yeah, I wish I could. If I could get an email or something. If you'd like, I can send and post a bibliography, like a 1-page bibliography for people who are interested, instead of trying to talk up different books off the top of my head right now. But yeah, I'd be very happy to contribute that. All right, thanks everybody. I love being back here. You're some of my favorite people on earth, so thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you to the Tocqueville Institute and to Dr. Gross and to the History Department. I really appreciate you all. Thanks. Have a great night. PowerPoints would have been hilarious.
They were full of memes, they put, this is Socratic torture here, but I approve of it.
But also, we can still do it without technology.
It's possible.
Yeah, it is possible.
Well, I hope you will join us for the last Tocqueville lecture series of the fall semester in 2 weeks on Thursday, October 21st, in this room again. We'll be having Mr. Brandon Fleming from Harvard University, the debate coach there. He's coming in to speak on critical thinking for critical times. He has a new book with a forward from Cornell West that looks at this idea of, do the ancients, do the classics provide us something of value, of worthwhileness in our own contemporary moment? Again, we thank the Jack Miller Center, we thank the Department of History and Foreign Languages for supporting tonight's lecture, and mostly we thank Dr. Donald Prudlo for it. Thank you again all for attending, either in person or digitally, and we hope to see you again in 2 weeks.